Good morning and welcome back to Spidz YouTube. The draft has just happened, maybe like an hour and a half ago, and over the last few days I've been working on this Google Slides, which is 36 slides long. Feel free to use this as a podcast, but, there will be images for those that want to glance at it from time to time. But I wanted to go over the draft. I think the draft is one of the most interesting parts of the CDS format, and I think that there's a lot to talk about, both in theory, what actually happened, and then some more, faraway thoughts about, the format as a whole, what's good and what's not good. But I'm going to go over a lot of the theory stuff that I talked with people about, and I hope you enjoy, because I think this is a really interesting part of the format, the drafting particularly. Let's quickly go into the thing where you look at the slides at a big menu. This one. There we go. So to recap the drafting rules, it's a snake draft with 10 champions each. You get 1 S tier, 2 A tier, 4 B tier, and up to 8 C tier. Now, when I say snake draft, it means that person that goes first, you get a list of 8 people. There's a first, second, third, fourth, fifth. And when you go through the draft, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right? So it goes forward and back, forward and back. It's like a pendulum, if you want to imagine it that way. There's a few ways you can imagine it in your head, but it's a snake draft. Importantly, to play a region in your deck, that deck must have a champ from that region. So Trundle, Tryndamere, Feel the Rush doesn't work because none of those champions are Shadow Isles. You could run a single Thresh or a single Maokai, but you would need to have drafted that beforehand. You can't do Ari Cannon without Bandle City, right? So you need to do Ari Cannon Thresh or something. So you could do Ari Cannon Go Hard, for example. Because of the type of person I am, I unfortunately took this in a very competitive and power-focused sense. I will talk about this much later on, but what you have to realize is as I'm talking through this, there's a sort of veneer of competitivity that encapsulates the entire thing. Now, that isn't an intrinsic necessity for your motion towards a draft format. I think towards a draft format, you can just have fun. In the end, Absolution first picks Jhin and second picks Kennen, because I don't know very much about Absolution, but I've heard about someone being like a Jhin Kennen fanatic, and I think I finally worked out who it was. So you can take this fun. I think a fair few of us did a mix of fun and competitivity. I think a fair few of us took it quite not fully competitive. I probably put more effort than was necessary in terms of discussing this, but for me, that effort was part of the fun experience, right? Talking with people, with Jansport, with Cephalopod, with Aniamar, with Donut, with Tank, these were enjoyable experiences that let us go through the cards, think about them in interesting ways, and see what sort of logic we can come up with based on the draft. So, first thing I'm going to go through is going through the champion tiers and explaining how the champions fit in their tiers. We're going to talk about things in so many different modes, but the first one we're going to go is talking about every tier and the champions throughout them. The first one is the S tier, right? You only get 1 S tier champion, and there are 2 champions that I think are a cut above the rest. The first one is Nora. I think Nora is even a cut above Trundle, but I think Nora is so plainly, obviously, the strongest champion in S tier. And whoever gets to pick Nora first has a really heavy advantage. I think Trundle is an insanely good second pick. I think Trundle plus any SI champion can probably give you a decent Feel the Rush list. Hecarim notably has Overwhelm. But even still, Trundle can work with timelines if you've got any sort of PNZ champion. And if you want to have a flexibility in your draft and have access to Freljord, I think Trundle's a really good option for that. The only thing to be wary of with Trundle is opportunity cost, right? Are you losing out on another champion you want, like your Katarina, your Gwen, your Vayne, because you spent your S champion on Trundle? That's the only main issue with Trundle. While Nora is so blatantly powerful that Nora plus pretty much any champion will be one of the strongest decks you can run. Even the worst champion you could think of, which was probably Malphite for Nora, is probably still a pretty decent deck. But if you put Trundle and Nora out of the equation, a lot of the other champions, in terms of just their inherent power, are quite interchangeable, right? They're all pretty flexible. They're all pretty powerful in their own way. You have the option of ranking them. You can rank them in I don't know, Gwen is better than Sivir. Akshan's probably better than Misfortune. But it's not necessary. All of the champions, Katarina, Vayne, Zoe, all of them have flexibility in them. They give you access to a region and give you a really good champion in that region and let you do whatever you want with that. But because you only get 1 S tier, I think it is a decent idea to pick it towards the end if you're trying to take this as competitively as possible, for a few reasons. One is that there are 3 superfluous S tier champions. If you are the final person to pick, you will know 1 of 4 what your champion will be, right? If you're the penultimate person to pick, you will know generally 1 of 5 what your champion will be unless someone steals it from you. In general, I think that going last on your S cost is a decent strategy unless there's like a blatant steal you can go for. Like no one took Nora on round 1, I'm going to go Nora round 2. Maybe Katarina is really important for your Annie and your Swain, like you're going to go triple broad main. Maybe Katarina's like a really good get at the time, right? Or Twisted Fate might allow you to go into Bilgewater with your Noxus decks, right? There are times where going for the S cost is important and it'll make one of your decks like really, really powerful, I think. But it isn't an intrinsic necessity to go early on the S tier. But I think S tier is the least interesting of the tiers. A tier, I think, is where it really starts breaking down into like where it's obvious where the power comes from, right? You get 2 A tier champions, which I wanted to keep this section, the theory section, not focused necessarily on what happened. But I think it should be noted that I think emotionally I exceedingly underestimated the limiting factor of only having 2 A tiers. Only having access to 2 of them really limits the amount that you can access. And 6 get wasted, right? There are 22 A tiers and 6 get wasted. But if you go through the champions in the A tier, I think in general you can find a lot of the high priority champions and some of them like decently priority champions, and you can sort of rank them in a certain way. So I think Ziggs and Gnar are pretty obviously high priority champions because they have the dual region. I think dual region is a very important thing to have access to, just to give you flexibility if you want to have flexibility in your decisions. And I think in a draft mode, I think flexibility is something that's pretty desirable. I think you would desire flexibility if you can go for it. And I think Pantheon and Victor are super important as like solitude win conditions that are so powerful that can be splashed with many things, right? Give Pantheon any Demacian champion, give Pantheon Varus, give Pantheon even like Noxus stuff with the Riven. Like Pantheon will work with most things that you give Pantheon. And Victor is just a 1 card that says win the game if you haven't interacted with me for 5 turns, right? Like Victor combines with so many regions with any champion you really want, and I think Victor's really powerful for that reason. All of these things apply just a little bit less, but they're basically the same logic for your Teemos, Aphelios, and Sejuani. Teemo is a champion that gives you 2 regions that are pretty decent with a like non-committal champion. Right, like Teemo doesn't ask you to do too much, and a 1 cost that does a little bit of damage is perfectly redeemable for a champion. I just realized I misspelled Aphelios. I am going to fix this for you. That is not the button that fixes things. Sorry, there's so many words in this document. I think if 1 typo is like justifiable. I think Aphelios is a really good example of a champion that you can just splash into anything and make the deck a lot more powerful because Aphelios has that intrinsic power. And I think Sejuani is pretty decent at that as well, especially since Sejuani can go with multiple regions in the same way that Victor can. Because Sejuani can make sense with Bandle City, can make sense with Bilgewater, can make sense with Noxus, can make sense with Shurima. I think Sejuani has a lot of access that I think is quite well afforded by Sejuani. I'm not going to go through the rest of the champions in the alright, low, pretty, poor. I think you can see the logic behind them. It's the same sort of delineation that I've given to the previous stuff, but slightly different. I'm going to make a quick note of Annie and Swain. I have deprioritized Noxus a little bit. Fundamentally, while I enjoyed like Drave and Ezreal, I'm not a big fan of like, or I've just not really played the Noxus decks that much. So to me, I knew going into this that the idea of like Annie and Swain is going to be like, it's going to be quite sexy to a lot of people to go for these sorts of like Noxus champions, try and have access to the Flock decks. But I don't really mind not having access to them. And if discarding that from my brain allows me to access stuff that I'm more interested in, that's fine. I'll talk later about why that may not have been the right choice. But I think that's why I've like deprioritized Annie and Swain. I don't think they're that great. I think I've probably put them in the right spots anyway. But if you're going to like argue against some of these, I think Annie and Swain are the ones that you're going to noticeably get irritated at. However, I think the A cost, the A tier, shows 3 really important things, like 3 big things that happen that we need to focus on regarding the mindset of the draft format. The first one is Bandle City value. There are many Bandle City cards in this area, and I think having access to Bandle City is quite important. Bandle City can play mid-range, aggro, and control. If you got 2 Bandle City champions and you're fighting someone that can't deal with tree, you can make 2 pretty bad double tree decks, but it's going to beat out these like super control decks that people might end up drafting. I think having Banner City is really, really powerful, and it lets you get the regions that you want, right? If you've got your Teemo, your Ziggs, your Gnar, you can go into Banner City for your Pokesticks, or you can go into your PNZs, your Chirimas, your Freljords, for whatever you desire. I think that Banner City champions just get that one extra bit stronger because they're from Banner City, right? And I think there's 6 Banner City champions: Fizz, Teemo, Lulu, Ziggs, Gnar, Heimer, Rumble. That's 7. 7 of them are in this area for that exact reason. The second thing you need to notice is the Heimer problem. Heimer sounds really, really nice. Heimer does have a lot of decks. You've got Heimer Jace. You can make Heimer work with the Nora. You can make Heimer work in SI. You can make Heimer work in like Demacia if you're really like desiring for it. Like, this is a draft format. You don't need to be only going for tier 1 and 2 decks. Like, you've got the option of flexibility. But the issue with Heimer is that all of his good SI decks aren't with SI champions, right? Heimer Jace does not allow you to play SI. Heimer Nora does not allow you to play SI. You can do something like Heimer Vigar, but the most important part of those decks has always been Nora. Heimer in Demacia sounds really nice until you realize that not only are Jace and Lux both B tier champions, meaning that you're not having as much opportunity cost, they're also just better than Heimer in those decks. You can make Heimer work in Targon, and you're going to want a Targonian champion for that. I think that's fine. But there are also other PNZ champions that work better for that capacity, such as your Victors, such as your Vys, such as even your Teemos, right? So I think Heimer shows one of the main issues with the region luck, where Heimer struggles to be in other regions. Now, that isn't impossible, right? This is a draft format, and I'm obviously taking this from the skew of like a pseudo-competitive lens, right? Like, you can get Heimer and Shen and just do Heimer Vi from aeons ago, and you use your twin disciplines and whatever, and boom, you've protected your Heimer, and you're happy. And the 2 play patterns that Heimer needs is either you can play Heimer because you've just tempo spiked, i.e. you've vengeanced at a really good time, you've shock blasted at a really good time, or you've done production surge at a very good time. All of these things give you enough of a tempo spike such that Heimer can come down in the SI decks, and you don't really care if he gets removed, or they had to spend so much mana that he can be played safely. Or, with Heimer, you're protecting him with your twin, you're protecting him with your Targon, Demacian or Ionian protection spells, and that's what keeps Heimer alive. Like, you get value by protecting him. Those are the 2 things you need for Heimer, and without those, I think Heimer can struggle quite a bit. The final thing is the sadness of 2. I've briefly mentioned this before, but S and A really have an issue of only having so limited options. B tier is a lot wider, right? B tier has a lot more options. You get 4, and you can make the bulk of your lineup based on your B tier. So I think the A tier is one of the more interesting tiers. I think it's really cool, but we shall move on to the B tier. I think the first thing that a lot of people notice when they look at the tier list is the higher standard deviation that is prominent in the B tier. There are champions that shouldn't have been in the B tier. They should have been in the A and S tier. And I've highlighted them for you now. Leona, Illaoi, Jax, and Varus, I think, are overpowered for their tier. Right? I think Leona is one of the most powerful champions you can get, as is Varus. Leona, for example, allows you to play control with like any sort of SI deck, or even like Freljord. Like, you can just play Leona in anything. Mid-range, aggro with like Noxus stuff. You can do pretty much anything you want with Leona. Varus is extremely powerful as just like his own package. Varus can accomplish quite a bit that you want in life. So I think Varus is definitely one of the better ones. Illaoi is very similar to Varus, although I think slightly less powerful, like as an intrinsic thing. And I am slightly biased towards Jax. I'm a big fan of Jax, but Jax does the same sentence as Illaoi and Varus, in that they're inherently strong single packages that can just take over the game, right? All of them also have Overwhelm and like a billion stats, right? I think that it's fairly obvious that if you're gonna try and like steal things, I think these are some of the biggest steals. Now, I don't know how important focusing on high standard deviation is, but when you combine like the standard deviation and the opportunity cost, I think it makes sense that you want to prioritize your B tiers, especially if you can have access to some of these. I've highlighted some yellow champions that I think are also pretty decent. I think they've got some intrinsic power in them that can allow them to be quite prominent. You can debate them, like Kayn, Aatrox, and Viego have all been nerfed since their like heyday, right, of being like as powerful as I'm probably imagining them to be. But I think these champions are really, really good at showing like just how like intrinsically powerful you can have a certain idea and then just slap another champion onto it and boom, you've got a pretty decent deck. I think that these champions all have access to that, with Fiora being more of a support tool. Same with like Leona being like both a powerful endemic package and a support tool. Okay, we'll go on to the C tier. And the first thing I'm going to point out in the C tier is Thresh. Apparently, I brought up Thresh like way too much, and Jansport got really, not angry, but Jansport would comment like, oh, Spidz, why do you like Thresh so much? Just constantly. I think Thresh is the best C-cost champion. I think SI as a region is really, really powerful to be going for access to Vengeance. And I think Thresh is severely undercosted for its value. And I think Thresh doesn't just have to work with like your Nassuses, your Asols, your Trindamirs, your Anivias. You can make Thresh work with Pantheon, Zoe, Diana. Like, Thresh being like a decent challenger tool that stabilizes the game. His region really supports him really well in like the nebulous Watermai-esque piles. Thresh Asol was one of the things I was really gunning for. Even just like looking at this initially. And if I didn't get Thresh Asol, I thought, okay, I might be able to get Thresh Nassus. I might be able to get Thresh Nautilus even. Like, Thresh Nautilus is not bad, right? I think Thresh has a lot of options, especially within the C tier. But this image is going to look really ugly. You don't really need to focus on the specifics of the image. The ugliness is kind of the point. The point I'm trying to show with this image is how many sort of duos there are within the C tier, right? So Lurk is in the C tier. Starspring is in the C tier. Kaisar Evelyn is in the C tier. Now, just to remember with Kaisar, you do need to run a Shuriman champion with Kaisar, a Demacian champion with Kaisar to access Demacia, right? So unless you want to run like Kaisar Quinn, you might just be better off doing Evelyn Kaisar, right? Unless because you can't do mono Kaisar. It's the same thought with Ryze. Like, you need to run him with Yi or an Ionian champion. You can't run Ryze on his own. You've got Talia Malphite with Malphite's half here. You've got Deep. You've got Annie, etc. Now, you can debate some of these, right? I've gone to the part that's still, like, things are arguable to not be included here, right? Nasus, you don't need to include. Aurelia can work with Misfortune, right? Yasuo can work with things besides Katarina. I've just tried to mind flood the image and show how many sort of, like, intrinsic duos there are, like, things that are implicitly duos and don't work as well without their, like, intended duo. But it doesn't... My main point here is just to say that a lot of the C tiers are like your duo champions. So if you remove all the things I've circled, right, your pool becomes a lot lower, and half of them aren't particularly strong champions, right? Like your Braum, your Vladimirs, your Trindamirs, kind of your Aries, kind of your Karmas. Now, these are fine. You can make them work. I think they're decent, but I think that this image, to me, shows how the C tier is formed, right? The C tier is formed with a lot of these duos and a lot of these low power champions. But I'll go back to this page. I think the C tier has a lot of interesting stuff in it, and I think prioritizing what you're going to get out of the C tier early so you're not having like so much of a run of the litter is something that might be important to go for. But that's the C tier. So to recap, the S tier has Nora and Trundle, and everything else is pretty just like equal power level, all have a lot of flexibility and so forth. The A tier has a lot of decent champions, a lot of good champions, a lot of decent champions, but the runt of the litter does get a little saddening. But because there's 6, you actually don't need to worry too much about that runt of the litter, right? Like, if we say the worst 3 champions are Jarvan, Udyr, Nocturne, right, and then the ones worse than that, slightly less bad than that, are your, like, Heimerdingers, you're still going to get, like, decent champions. You're not going to be too upset with your A tiers, I don't think. B tier, I think it has the highest standard deviation, especially with those highs of Leona, Varus, Illaoi. I think the lows are a little bit saddening for B tier, but they're not the worst things in the world. You can make them happen. And with the C tier, making sure that you're not having only like half of a duo can be concerning, but obviously we'll be safe by Thresh. Thresh will save everything, and we'll all be happy by Thresh. All right. Let's talk about regions. I think regions is an important thing to be analyzing in terms of like flexibility in your drafting phase, right? Like, you want to make sure that you're not limiting yourself from certain regions, and you want to make sure that the regions that you've drafted in twice are things that you want to be playing 2 times of in your lineups, right? Because I think some regions you don't want to be playing 2 of in your lineup, and some regions you do want to be playing 2 of in your lineup. And I think keeping that ahead of time is something that's going to be really, really important to keep track of. The first is Bandle, which we've talked about a little bit before. But Bandle, you need for your flexibility, right? I think Bandle as a flexibility thing is really, really important. So having access to these 7 up here, I think, is something that is decently prioritized. You just need to be super wary of opportunity cost in the A tier. And I think Kennen is shown. I think Kennen should have been in a B tier. I think Kennen is one of the best options, and I probably would have taken Kennen quite early if it was available to me at the time. Because Kennen giving you access to just the same logic as I said for Teemo, right? It's low commitment, right? It's just a 1-mana card that does decent statage. It does fine enough things. It gives you access to Ionia and Bandle City, especially Bandle City in sort of like any sort of aggressive deck. If you've got like, if you push comes to shove and you've got Illaoi and no champion to pair with Illaoi, tack on Kennen, tack on your Syncopations and your Ghosts, or even tack on Pokey Stick and the other stuff, right? Like, I think Kennen gives you flexibility. I think Kennen was quite put down too low than he deserved to be. But I think Bandle City is really important for getting you that flexibility. I think it's important to have at least one Bandle City champion. If you could choose more, I would probably go for that. But the issue with choosing more is that one of those is probably end up going to be your your A tier champion. And you don't want to limit yourself too much by having 2 Bandle City A tier champions. I think that could actually hanker you quite a bit. Unless you've got like your Ziggs and your Gnar. I think Ziggs and Gnar are maybe the best A tier champions, right? Let's talk about Runeterra. I think for similar reasons about like Bandle City giving you flexibility, Runeterra champions need to be wary of in not limiting your deck choices, right? If you have 2 or God forbid 3 Runeterra champions, while a lot of them are powerful enough in their own regions, I think it is hard to justify having too many because it's going to limit your flexibility in what you can deck build. Regarding lineup construction. Now, regarding individual deck construction, I think Runeterra champions allow you a lot of flexibility, right? Like, if you've got Jax and like 5 regions to choose from, that's very cool. That's going to be very interesting. But fundamentally, I know you're going to play a Jax deck. I know that is mid-range. It is not anything but mid-range. As opposed to drafting something like an SI and a Targon. That is going to be mid-range. It can go into control. SI Targon was a really bad example for the point I'm trying to make. Noxus Targon. Noxus Targon you could make mid-range, you can make it aggro, and you can make it slightly control-y. But if you're running Jax, I know you're running, the Jax package. If you're running Aatrox, I know it's a similar thing. I think the red ones are probably the best ones to have multiples of. I think the yellow ones you need to be slightly wary of in terms of what you're able to deck build. And Rise is Rise. Rise is very clearly absurdly strong, and any Ionian champion will make Rise a very happy boy. Let's move on. Shadow Isles. I think Shadow Isles as a region is really, really powerful. I think having access to Vengeance, Withering Wail, Vile Feast, and knowing what you're going to be fighting. If I know I'm fighting someone that's picked 3 Bandle City champions, I'm going to feel really happy picking Vile Feast, Withering Wail, even stuff like Withering Soul or whatever it's called. Withering Mist, I think it's called, and like Grasp of the Undying, right? Like, I know what I'm going to be fighting going into the weeks, and I think having Shadow Isles giving you that modular capacity is a really powerful concept to be messing around with. I think that there are some Shadow Isles champions that have, like, inherently strong packages. I'm surprised I put Hecarim in red. I think Hecarim was supposed to be in yellow. I do apologize for that. Same with Maokai. I think I forgot to change the colors of 2 of these. I mean, Maokai being C-cost means there's not much opportunity cost, but, like, Gwen and Elise and Kindred, I think, are pretty decent. They're going to give you something that you want in SI, and all of them just give you, like, an insanely powerful package. Or not even just a package, but, like, when I say package, I mean, like, the Vengeance and the Vile Feast. I don't necessarily mean the Fading Icon, or the Spirit Journey, or the Hapless Aristocrat, right? So I think having an SI champion in your back pocket to have access to a Vengeance deck if you're going to need to playing Vengeance, I think is a strong idea to have access to. And if you wanted to have multiple of certain regions, I think SI is one of the best regions to go for to have multiple of. Right? I would love to have Kindred and Thresh and Gwen, and then just have like a random Targonian, a random Piltover, a random Bandle Cityan, maybe a random Freljordian, although I'm not really a big fan of SI Freljord control. And just play that. I think that would be super fun, and I think that would be super powerful as well. Now we've got the Donut Corner, which is Freljord. If you heard what I said about Vengeance, Vile Feast wanting both of these cards, you can flip that in your mind to thinking, I might want like Buried in Ice or Harsh Winds, right? Having this dichotomy is also pretty powerful, right? If you're fighting a bunch of Illaoi, Fiora, Leona, Aatroxes, you can just run like double or triple Buried in Ice lineups and beat them, while simultaneously also having your Harsh Winds for your Illaois, your Varuses, and so forth, right? And I think what is good about having a few Freljord champions is this dichotomy. However, I think it is probably too cute to try and go for a plural Freljord strategy to do this sort of Buried in Ice Harsh Winds gameplay. Because I think Freljord, unfortunately, doesn't have deck building that much past a Buried in Ice and Harsh Winds. I think Buried in Ice Ice and Harsh Winds are really good strategies against anyone that's running a bunch of mid-range. And it's not going to be awful if you're fighting something and you're not going to run your Buried in Ice or your Harsh Winds and you're just going to do some sort of like, you know, Ash Nox, Trundle timelines, but with no Buried in Ice, like that sort of nonsense. Like Trundle, sort of like decent mid-range or something, but Buried in Ice, Harsh Winds, I think, is an interesting dichotomy to explore, but I don't think it is worth the necessary effort to go for, especially since there is a stark difference between like the top 5 champions and the bottom 5 champions. Udyr is a bit weirdly placed, but like Ornn, Ashe, Braum, and Nivea Tryndamere are so demonstrably worse than Sejuani, Gnar, Trundle that like if you can get Sejuani, Gnar, Trundle, and maybe Lissandra, you're going to feel really happy about your Freljord pick. But if your second Freljord pick is going to be one of these, you really have to justify it quite well. Now, it's not impossible to justify. Like, 3 Braum isn't going to really hurt you all that much. It's going to hurt you a little, but it's a draft format. Like, the power level will be slightly lower. But I think that's an issue with the Freljord champions. But it's something you can go for. Noxus, which is, I think, on everyone's radar because of the... I forgot to change this color. Yeah, Spidz. I think Noxus makes a lot of sense for like modern lineup construction, right? Like the way that the meta has shifted with the recent buffs to Illaoi Jax, Varus still being good, blah, 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 is the resurgence of like Noxus stuff. And so I think a lot of people seeing that are going to see the Noxus options and be like, cool, I get to do a bunch of Noxus stuff. A lot of the champions are passable, like LeBlanc, Riven, Rumble, even Vladimir. Like they're passable champions. You're not going to be ecstatic that it isn't Annie or isn't Swain or isn't Katarina. But if I'm going to run like a broad main deck in this low power level format, I'm not going to be upset that LeBlanc needs 2 mana to be interacted with or does a bunch of damage, right? That's fine. So I think broad main's something to go for. I'll be honest, I haven't played LOR for like 10 days. And 10 days is a hyperbole. I haven't done my Runeterra Open at the time of recording this, and I didn't even finish any Gauntlet last week. I did the Unlimited Champions Gauntlet, but I only got like 5 wins into the previous Gauntlet. I haven't been playing much LOR. Mostly I've been distracted by Hades and doing like recreational things like good. If I say recreational things, you guys are gonna think like drugs. Like Hades and like, you know, cooking and stuff. I haven't had that much time to play LOR. And okay, ignore this. I hate the time slots for the fucking Gauntlet. Because when I want to play LOR, it starts at around like 10 p.m. and ends at around like 3 a.m. 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. is my LOR time, but for Australians, that's when the Gauntlet closes. I wanted to play my Runeterra Open. It closed at 11 p.m., which is when I logged on to play my Runeterra Open. This wasn't some sort of like, oh, I'm gonna deeply strategize. I'm gonna make sure that no one, I fight all the bad players. This is just when I play LOR. And like the Runeterra Open and the Gauntlet being at the time has been super disappointing. Now I've got other thoughts on the Gauntlet. If you want me to talk about the Gauntlet for like 30 minutes, I can actually make a separate video about that because I think my issues with the Gauntlet I think are really personal. And if anyone shares those opinions, I think it'd be interesting to like have that in like the conversation of all possibilities. What's it called? Like the air of conversation. There's a word I'm looking for. There's a word I'm looking for about, you know, putting words into the air so that the conversation can meld around it. I've got a lot of thoughts about the Gauntlet that I can talk about later, but anyway, I've barely played LOR that much recently, so I've not had the qualia of fighting Broadmain. I've not had the qualia of playing Broadmain. I know Broadmain is very, very strong, but there are champions that I'm just not going to take. I am not going to take Nami. I am not going to take Soraka. Soraka is a joke. Soraka. These are champions that I just don't enjoy. So I was never going to take them to begin with. And so Noxus champions in general, for the idea of Broadmain, is something I'm also not that fan of. Now, I love Rumble. I love Katarina. I love Riven. I kind of like Darius. And I am fine playing Swain, right? Like, and Draven. Like, these champions I'm fine with, but not in a Broadmain sense. I like them in their aggros. I like them in their controls. Like, when I say control, I mean, like, you know, like the way Darius controls in a mid-range deck. I know that sounds weird, but, you know, he's a big unit. He controls the way the game plays out in that sort of sense. Anyway, let's move on to PNZ and Ionia. PNZ and Ionia, I think, are some of the examples of regions that I think aren't as powerful to spec into, right? Either because they're overshadowed by other regions you can spec into, or because the fundamental, like, power point of those regions isn't prominent enough. So we'll start with PNZ. I think the issue with splashing into PNZ, same with Ionia, but is that PNZ doesn't have win conditions that aren't champions, right? So Victor is a win condition, Jinx is a win condition, Seraphine is a win condition, and Bar used to be a win condition, but with Bar's nerf, and like Bar is still fine. You can make like Seraphine Targon work; it'll work fine in this format. But Seraphine's that win condition, and the other champions are support cards. Caitlyn, Echo, Vi, like these are support cards. Ezreal, like these are all support cards. And so if I'm trying to like build a lineup where I do like 2 PNZ champions, I think I'm going to struggle with finding the point of doing it with the PNZ and the focus, right? And so I think splashing into PNZ doesn't accomplish much unless you've got very specific decks in mind, or you're running Victor because Victor's bonkers. That's an issue with PNZ. Very similarly for Ionia. Ionia doesn't have win conditions. Not really. You can try and make Lee Sin work. You can try and make Karma work. But everything else is a support card for Ionia. And so I think splashing into double Ionia doesn't make too much sense. That is the problem with those regions. The other problem is the comparative, right? The value that you can get, like the ideological argument that, oh, I get to run Mystic Shot, I get to run Thermo Beam with your PNZs, is trumped by the Vile Feast Vengeance fork of Shadow Isles. Same for Ionia. I get to run Will, I get to run Homecoming, I get to run Deny. Isn't as good as I get to run Rite of Negation, or I get to run Vengeance Vile Feast with your Shadow Isles. I think Shadow Isles as a region to splash into for flexibility in your deck building isn't as good as your SI options. Probably with your Noxus options as well, by the way. I think Noxus probably trumps these as well. Probably Bandle City and Freljord as well. It's just, I don't think these options as like flexibility for pseudo control decks doesn't come across much. Now, I think it would be fun to have 3 Ionia decks and force yourself to run like triple Ionia in that fashion. And Ionia does have awkward aggro tools that you can make work with, Zed and like Keeper of Masks and all that nonsense, your Greenglade duos. But I think in general, it doesn't work as well as you would hope. Is the theory. All of this I'm talking about so far is theory. I'm going to go over what my draft strategy was, considering all of this in mind, regardless of what placement I got in the snake draft, right? The logic I ended up deciding on was to prioritize A and B tier. I think B tier, because of the high standard deviation, is pretty important to prioritize, and A tier has some really important champions that you're going to need to make sure form the core of some of your strategies and your ideas. The S tier, because one of them will pretty much always be good, you can leave till the end, and the C tier has less high priority champions besides like Thresh, Karma, Kennen, maybe Rise, depending on the type of player you are. If you go through all the regions, you can see what I think the high priority picks are. You've got Trundle and Nora for these, and then if these are gone, leave till the end unless there's an opportunity for like a really good steal. Like someone hadn't take Trundle by round 3, you can take Trundle and no one's gonna that's gonna be a really good strategy for you. Aphelios, Sig, Gnar, Pantheon, Victor, I think are the highest priority A tiers. I think we've talked about all of these before when going up before. Besides that, go for Bandle City champions. Besides that, wait for major synergy points or regions, right? Like the A tier can give you like the access to a region and a champion that you want in that deck when you have that region, as opposed to Maokai, which you don't really want in your SI region option. Leona, Jax, Pantheon, Illaoi, Fiora. Maybe ignore Fiora, you can replace it with something else. But Leona, Jax, Pantheon, Illaoi have that access to intrinsically powerful strategies that I think you want to get quite early. And then I'm, for some reason, a Thresh obsessive. I think Thresh is a really good option for just the flexibility it gives you towards any sort of strategy. Karma, Kennen also works. And then you should probably wait for this later on. You've got the option of pining for duos at some point. Like if Pike and Rek'Sai is still available, like in your round 6 or 7, you can go for Pike and Rek'Sai. But anyway, this is what I predicted the rounds would look like. I expected in round 1, Trundle and Nora to be gone, Gnar, Ziggs or Victor to be gone, a Noxus champion to be gone, and Pantheon to be gone. And I expected Varus and Leona to be gone. A spoiler, I was correct on about half of this. A Nora and a Sporadic, not Trundle, went. I think Gnar might have gone. A Noxus champion, I think, went. And Varus, Leona, and Illaoi went. Someone picked Kennen first. Not Kennen. Someone picked Jhin first, which was not on my radar as a first pick. But that's fine. Then I thought people would pick 2 of the, the pretty equidistant champions for all of the rest of the S tiers. I thought Aphelios, whatever's left out of Gnar's Victor would be gone, and maybe a second Banal champion would be gone. I expected these to go in this sort of like vague order because I think these are powerful ideas, and I expected me to be taking Thresh at this point. Because I really thought that a lot of the more powerful options, more powerful than Thresh, would be taken before Thresh was available. In round 3, I thought that they'd get 1 or 2 more of these. You'd get your Sojourners, your Talia, your last Banal City champion, and maybe a weird option like your Jarvan or something. And if Ryze wasn't gone by this time, I would have been a little surprised, and Karma and Kennen, I think, are some of the high priorities S tiers. And then I think at this point, you're starting to get people that take champions because they like them, they like the strategies that they employ, and the play patterns that they like to go for. Whatever, like, obvious logic you're thinking, like, oh, obviously you should go, you know, Tahm Kench, because Tahm Kench works with any sort of Noxus champion if you want to do, like, you know, your Noxus Buildwater control deck. And if you get Soraka, congrats, now you've got the flexibility of Soraka Tahm Kench. Whatever logic you're thinking of is probably fine, but I think after this point, like, personal compatibility takes priority over this impersonal sort of logic. And I think any sort of, like, further exploration of going through this thing is probably more unhelpful than helpful. Alright. This is what the draft placement was. It was Puffball Panda, Absolution, Mafrahu, Capital Circuit, Elzon, Tempo Mao, Aikado, and Spidz. And you'll notice I'm last. That was me. Being 8th. What does this actually mean? It means strategically, it means that I'm probably going to miss out on Trundle, Nora, and some amount of the Varus, Leona, Aphelios, Narzigs pile, right? Pantheon should probably be in there. On the assumption that more than 50% of the people are playing with the semblance of competitivity in mind, right? Which isn't intrinsically true, but I should be able to get at least 2 of my highly desired champs nonetheless, because there are around 14, like, pretty good highly desired champions. And while I'm going to miss out on the Nora, which is obviously the strongest one, I'm probably pretty likely to get some of these. Now, strategically, apparently being 8th is referred to being the wheel. I've not played other draft games like Magic, but when talking to Jansport, he kept calling me a wheel. So when it comes to being the wheel, I have the opportunity to do, like, dual powerful things. If Echo and Zillion are both available during what I will be calling, like, 3-4 or 4-5, 3-4 or 5-6, right? Like when I do my double pick, my 5-6 and my 3-4, I can go for Zillion Echo, right? I can just get them immediately with no one having the opportunity to interact with me, right? I think while that's an alluring idea to go for that, I don't think that's as valuable as going for long-term strategic value by taking something like a Leona and a Aphelios through that time. By the way, there's a loud noise outside my house. I hope you can't hear it. I think if it's 7 and 8 and, like, Pike and Rek'Sai are both still available, it is perfectly redeemable to go for Lurk at that time. But I think for your 5-6s, it's probably better to just go Thresh and Fiora. You're not going to combine them together, but they're going to be good challenger champions that combine with anything, right? I'm going to go through some of the mindsets. Now, I've used these logics. Oh my god, I forgot to update Opportunity Cost. I wrote that as a joke. I forgot to update that. I'm going to go through some of the mindsets I think are quite valuable, and I've mentioned these a lot prior, but I think, like, solidifying these into some of the general play patterns that you should be going for during the drafting phase, I think are things that are worth, like, keeping in mind. Like, these are the logic pieces that you get once seeing the draft and seeing draft formats in general. I'm going to have a drink of water quickly. Alright, Opportunity Cost. When it comes to S and A, you have to make sure that you're not taking Victor to the exclusion of Gnar and being upset at that, right? Like, you're only going to get 2 A costs. You've got to make sure, by explicitly picking one, you're implicitly not picking another option. I think that fundamental nature of the draft format is really important when you're prioritizing what is important from each region. Simultaneously, with opportunity cost, you need to be wary that, like, picking, like, 3 B tiers before you start an A tier might mean that you get the better B tiers, but you're going to get the worse A tiers. And keeping that in mind, that you only get to select at certain opportunities, is part of the process of discovering what priorities you want to go for. I feel like I've just said a bunch of buzzwords. None of them really meant anything. Moving on. Early long-term value, later solidifying their power. I think as a general wave of how I think this should go, I think your first 3 rounds, you should probably be looking for splashable champions, whether they're low build costs, such as Thresh and Fiora, or innately strong packages, such as your Varus, Pantheon, Leona. Having these in your back pocket so that during your later rounds you can just find a synergy piece for them, I think is quite powerful. And I think having them early is just important, right? Like these are what everyone's going to be desiring early on. It's important to get them as soon as possible. And that is really loud. I don't know. It sounds like a massive juicer, but it's definitely not a juicer because it wouldn't be that loud considering it's like hundreds of meters away. I don't know if it's hundreds of meters. I'm not good with distances. You can solidify these choices on your 7 to 9, right? Once you pick Varus, you can go with your Zoe or your Teemo or your Action or your Fizz or your Nami to sort of like make sure you've got 2 to 3 strong tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 decks, right? Like make sure you've got these access to these decks. But during your 4 and 7, you can also continue going for long-term value. Options like Zoe does both, right? Like a Zoe gives you long-term value. You can combine Zoe with most things. And you can combine Zoe with your Varuses or whatever, your Leonas, right? I think for your 8 and 10, it's pretty worth focusing on just your short-term values. If you've got Thresh, make sure you just get your Asol or your Nasus or whatever. If you've got Talia, get your Malphite by that point. There's no reason going for, like, I'm going to take Kennen 9th just because maybe 10th I'll get something really cute with Kennen. I think you want to be taking Kennen with the explicit idea of Kennen's going to combine with my Ahri. Like, I took Ahri on round 5 or something. I'm specifically taking Kennen purely for that reason. It doesn't need to be too splashable. Unless there are still splashable champions around that aren't like that, but that seems quite rare. You want to be making sure that your last 3 ones you're probably picking with some like decent amount of purpose. Obviously, this is broad and malleable. You can do whatever the hell you want, and I think like condensing yourself into like a specific like 1, 2, 3 we do this, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 we do this is probably like a bit diminutive to the like possibilities of the format. Being 8th, I think it's sort of valuable to view being 8th or 1st, realizing that you are at the end of each pendulum. Each time the pendulum ball goes to you, it's going to be a very different looking scenario than before, right? Like the difference between missing out on 14 options of champions is very much going to change the point that you're at in the draft, right? Like the point of the draft goes through phases, and I think realizing that you're only going to get 4 phases, you got to make sure that you know what you're going to do at each of those phases and what the best options at that phase is. I think that's an important thing to be recognizing compared to that of your 5ths who are in the center and like experience much smaller phases. And I think keeping that in mind is important for how you plan to do your 1 and your 8s. Regarding duos, I think duos have a champ that are better than the other to take. I think it's important to just take the better one, right? Nautilus can work with any SI champion and possibly even some P and Z champions. Better than Maokai can work in other places. You can put Maokai to have access to SI. You can, like, in theory, run Maokai in your, like, weird-ass aggro deck, right? With Glenkeeper or whatever, right? But I think Maokai is, like, fundamentally less powerful than Nautilus because Deep is going to be a good option in a low-power format. And having, like, Thresh Nautilus, Elise Nautilus, Gwen Nautilus, like, these things will work fine. So I think Nautilus is a higher priority than Maokai. I think Talia, Katarina, and Annie, like, we already know they don't need their Malphites, Lissandras, Yasuos, and Jins because these champions are some of the best champions in the game, right? I think Kench is inherently more splashable than Soraka. And then you've got some debatables. Is Pyke or Rek'Sai better, right? Pyke you can use to access Bilgewater and is technically on-spot removal. But Rek'Sai technically works better with Overwhelm stuff, and maybe Shurima is a better region than Bilgewater to go for. Because Kaisa, you need to run a Demacian champion. Unless you've got a Demacian champion you're decently happy to run with Kaisa, you could actually probably justify Eve, only because Eve can get you Kaisa or Viego, or push comes to shove Lucian, right? Kaisa nearly demands Eve or Demacia, while I think Eve has 3 or 4 regions you can slightly justify going for, at least 3 or 4 champions that you can slightly justify going for. Kaisa is probably better, but, you know, I think you could debate it. Now, there's Aurelia or Azir. Aurelia is a C tier, but Azir is an A tier, right? Do you go for Aurelia because it's low opportunity cost? Or do you go for Azir because it synergizes with more things? Like, Azir can work with a lot of things. It can work with Xerath, it can work with, like, Noxus aggro, it can work with Demacia aggro. It can probably work with Bilgewater aggro. You can make it work with SI with, like, an aggressive ephemeral step. Like, Azir has options, while Aurelia primarily has Gwen, MF, and Azir. And that's... You'd be hard-pressed to find an Aurelia deck besides, like, really awkward, you know, Black Flame Z options, right? Which are fine with Aurelia, but I don't think that's the position you necessarily want to be in when you're more often than not going to find better options you can go for. Power versus flexibility. I think LOR as a game struggles to have a draft format like this work because of some of the issues with power versus flexibility. There are so many innately powerful champions that the power of that champion trumps the flexibility of the result. I think that there are so many champions that could be considered flexible, but when you're building or when you're drafting, but once you play the game, you'll realize that they're just like stupidly powerful. Varus, Pantheon, Illaoi, Jax, etc., right? These things can be splashed with nearly anything, but that's not a token of their like cute flexibility. That's not like, oh, I'm getting to run Teemo, I can run Pokey Stick or Mystic Shot. You know, it's flexible only because anything can work with it and it'll probably be fine. I think flexibility is much more fun. I think having an option like, if your lineup was something like Karma, Teemo, Shen, I think you're going to have a lot more fun in this format than going for Pantheon, Varus, Leona, Aphelios or something, right? Yeah, and then sometimes things that are both powerful and flexible have the powerfulness overpower the flexibility, and making it seem like power should take priority. And finally, when you look at your final pool, it's going to be missing stuff. It's going to be missing stuff that you wish you would have had, and this needs to be acquiesced, right? Like, I don't think there's much you can do, and I think it's important to have this in mind. This is like a massive warning to me because spoilers, I'm pretty unhappy with my draft, and I have to like realize that whatever fantasy world I'm thinking of where I do have a more interesting draft is at the cost of something else that I liked, right? How long have I been recording? 47 minutes. This is actually much faster than I thought it would be. This probably means I haven't gone as in-depth as I like. I'd probably have done too much surface level analysis. But okay, we've talked about the theory. All of this was stuff I was planning to say before the draft. Like everything I just said was stuff I was going to say before today. But the draft has happened, and let's talk about the draft. So I got Gwen, Gnar, Pantheon, Varus, Illaoi, Fiora, Darius, Thresh, Shen, Taric. It's hard to read. This is... Sorry, I hit my mic. This is the sheet that we got in order to, like, when we were doing our draft. This is what at least I was looking at, because they were updating this at real time. And just notice some patterns here. There are 8 4-mana champions. There are 5 overwhelm champions and 10 mid-range champions. I failed flexibility. I stun-locked myself out of flexibility. I can blame the timer a little. I think if I had more time, I probably wouldn't have picked some of the champions I picked. So I think Gnar and Varus were good first options. I think Pantheon and Illaoi were inherently powerful, and I thought they would be gone before I had the option of picking them, which made me think that I should have picked them. I think in retrospect, I wish I hadn't picked Illaoi. I think Illaoi stun-locked me into going for too overly aggressive for mid-range, and I wish I hadn't done that. I went Thresh and Fiora for splashable options, especially Thresh. I wanted to have the option of control. And I wanted Fiora because I thought that, okay, I think you can make Varus work with nearly anything, and I really enjoyed Pantheon Fiora. You can also make Fiora work with a lot of things, and push comes to shove, I can run Pantheon Varus. I've never played Pantheon Varus. Jansport saw me get Pantheon Varus and was like, okay, cool, you got Pantheon Varus, you're sort of winning. But I feel a bit bad. I actually don't really like Pantheon Varus. I think it's kind of boring. Me saying this as I've not played it, but I just think, like, conceptually, I've always disliked a big Pantheon. Pantheon Fiora was the only time I really liked Pantheon, which is why I was pretty keen emotionally for going for Fiora so I can play Fiora Pantheon. Then I went Darius and Shen. Darius is so it can work with Gnar. At some point I realized that I don't actually have any Bandle City champions left available because of the opportunity cost. All of them are in A tier. Kennen was taken by round 2 by fucking Absolution, so I couldn't go for Kennen for a second Bandle City. And at the point that it was for like round 7 and 8. The only options were Yuumi, and it was just Yuumi, right? Yeah, for Bandle City champions, it was just Yuumi at that point. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to go for Bandle City anymore. So I needed something to work with Gnar, and I went with Darius. Now, Gnar can work with Thresh. You can make some shitty control deck with Gnar and Thresh, right? You can probably make Gnar and Shen work. Like, you can make all of these things work. But in comparison to the other options I've got for those slots, it doesn't make much sense to, right? If I'm trying to play Gnar and Shen, it's like, look at me, I'm a cute control mid-range deck. Why is that taking precedence over a lineup that says, like, Pantheon Fiora, Illaoi Shen, Varus Gwen, or something? Like, why is that taking precedent? Why is that taking precedent over Gnar Darius, Pantheon Varus, Illaoi Fiora? Right, like, I have got 3 really good mid-range decks. Going for the 4th and the 5th is just not good. It's not a good draft option. So I think my issue was setting myself up for failure by picking Varus and Pantheon and Illaoi. Now, I think Pantheon, Varus, and Illaoi, if you imagine like a plastic container, or like a big plastic tub, right? I think you can comfortably fit two high power mid range champions, Pantheon and Paris, Pantheon and Varus, in your like plastic cardboard box, and you can say, cool, I've got, you know, like a little bit of room for another mid range champion, but I don't really want any more mid range champions. Then you can imagine like forcing Illaoi in, and your plastic box is extending, right? Your plastic box is sort of like trying to break. It's still structurally keeping in order. If it stays like that, it'll stay like that. But the plastic clearly does not want to be like that. I think that's the issue. That's what happened with Pantheon, Varus, Illaoi. I think it could have worked, but it was starting to feel as if your plastic box wasn't enjoying it. And then I just shoved Fiora in there, and that's what made it explode. You can blame Fiora for that, but I would rather blame Illaoi for that, right? Because I think Fiora, Pantheon, and Varus would have fit all together, but I think Illaoi has the sort of flavor that makes it so that doesn't work. So I think Illaoi was a regret of mine. I wish I had picked a more control-y champion, or a champion that permitted me to go for that route. Illaoi is definitely powerful, but I wish I hadn't gone for it. And once you see Gnar, Varus, Pantheon, Illaoi, your synergy points are going to have to be typically other mid-range champions. You can go for Nami and do Nami Varus. You can go for like a nebulous Illaoi aggro-y deck, right? You go Illaoi with, I don't know, Draven. And then you've suddenly got a deck that plays for overwhelm, plays for high stats, and tries to like hit them quickly. But that's not going to be as powerful as the options of going for mid-range. And when you're in a situation where you've only got like 5 minutes to pick between your champions, I decided that the obvious choice would just be go for mid-range and not flounder myself over by picking something like, I don't know, a Malphite, and then having myself... Oh, Malphite's bad because that's another fucking mid-range deck. Picking Karma straight up, just so that I'm forced to pick something that synergizes with Karma later. I would have gone Thresh first, but whatever. And I think in general, you'll see that as a problem. I've got too many mid-range champions. And I think my draft was wrong because of that. But I think that was supposed to be on a different slide. My breath is low, there's too much synergy, which I think I explained on the next slide. Nope, that's not that slide. It's... Did I delete the slide? Oh, no. Because, like, I'm noticing there are two slides here that are the exact same. These two, that you don't look different, but they're the exact same. I think I deleted the slide that used to be there and replaced it with this one on accident. Whoops. Alright, I have fixed the slides, and this is what I wanted to show. That I have too much interplay unnecessarily. Right, Pantheon can work with Varus and Fiora. Pantheon works, like, inherently with Pantheon and Fiora. And you can make Pantheon work with Darius and Shen and Thresh and all of that nonsense. Varus intrinsically works with Pantheon and Taric, but can work with pretty much anyone. Like, I think you can make a deck with Varus and any one of these champions. Illaoi can work with Shen and Fiora and can work with pretty much any of the champions. Fiora can work with Shen, Illaoi, Panth, Varus. Probably work with all of them, to be honest. Like, Fiora, Darius, you could even probably make work just, like, somewhat okay. Gwen, Shen, Taric, Thresh, Gnar, Darius are all decent supports. Now, I've done this little section here, which is just me copying this format, just to show that, like, there are probably 3 champions that each thing can work with, in comparison to some people who have, like, Azure Aurelia, or who have Jhin Cannon, right? Like, they are half locked into those options. But that's not a dichotomy. There are people who have Zoe, there are people who have Katarina, there are people who have these champions that are definitely more broadable. Now, I can broadable without all just being mid-range options. And while these have plural options, fundamentally, these decks are all the same. While I think, like, Zoe plus 3 different regions are 3 different decks. While Pantheon plus a lot of these regions is still just a Pantheon deck. Varus plus different regions still is a Varus deck. Illaoi plus different regions is still an Illaoi deck. And I think that's disappointing in how I ended up drafting. Okay, Let's go to the champions I would have really liked. Leona.
I think I feel pretty good about picking up. Wait, who's after me? Spidz. I think I want Leona.
Oh,
Leah.
stop you. God damn it. I wanted Leona. I would have really liked Leona. Right, Leona is like my perfect champion for this format. It's mid-range, which is, you can tell, like, it's a format of mid-range overwhelm champion. Like, it's what I like. It's not overwhelm anymore, but, you know, it used to be overwhelm for like a little bit of time. And it can work into control and aggro, right? You can do Leona plus Thresh, and boom, you've got a pretty decent What Am I pile, right? You can do Leona plus any sort of Noxus champion, you've got a pretty good aggro deck. I would have loved Leona, which is why I'm not surprised that it was taken. And I think my biggest sadness about being 8th was that I couldn't get Leona. Because I think Leona would have been my first pick had I been, like, 3rd. I probably would have forced myself to pick Nora, but had I been 3rd or 4th or 5th, I would have taken Leona immediately. Aphelios is another really fan-favorite champion of mine. I really like it. My issue with Aphelios is that the availability that it was for me at my 3 and 4, I had already taken an A, and it seemed like Pantheon was too strong to give up. I wish I'd probably taken Aphelios instead of Pantheon in terms of giving myself more flexibility and more fun in deck building, but I just didn't do it. Karma. I wish I had Karma. Karma was also taken for me by Aikado, just like Leona, a second before I was going to say it, which sucks because Karma was going to be my way to access deck diversity, right? Karma would have finally given me access to not playing mid-range. I can play Thresh Karma. I can play a control deck, and then Karma was gone, and then Asol had already gone, and then the only other champions left were mid-range champions or control champions that needed a very specific type of, like, control. I will say, like, most Illaoi champions are mid-range champions, I have found. Or they're, like, very specific duos. And even a lot of the duos are, like, mid-range champions. But anyway, I ended up not having Karma, and it was taken just before I should have gone for it. And finally, Akshan. Now, Akshan is one that I probably should have taken early. There was about 2 rounds where there were only 2 people who didn't have S tiers, me and Absolution. And Akshan was what I was hoping for. For some reason, I had sort of solidified in my mind that I was going to get Akshan and I can just do it 10th and feel fine. I didn't have that much time to think. Like, I know there was a lot of thinking time, but there's so many factors to consider that I didn't have the time in my brain to think maybe Akshan isn't guaranteed. Akshan would have changed everything. Like, Akshan allows me to do Pantheon and Varus. Now, there's an issue with Akshan. It's the same fucking problem I've said a million times where all I've got is mid-range. In the end, Gwen probably doesn't change much from Akshan in terms of the power level of my lineup. Because my power level of my lineup is very much defined by Pantheon, Varus, Illaoi, Fiora. Right? That is the power of my lineup, those 4 champions. And whatever other champion I'm adding to that lineup of, like, Akshan is nearly just the same thing. It's adding, like, the same idea to the lineup. So it's not the most crazy thing. But I would have liked Akshan because I think Akshan is fun. But it goes to the fundamental issue of my lineup that I think 2 is fine. 3 of the Pantheon Varus Illaoi is already pushing it, but you can make it work. And 4 of them was killing me. The regions that I do have and don't have. I've got 2 Targonians and 2 SIs, no PNCs and no Shirimans. I think having this in mind is nice, but I don't have the flexibility, right? I can't. It is hard for me to justify making, like, an SI Targon deck, What Am I pile, because the decks that I'd be supporting that with would struggle, right? Like, let's say I was trying to build a triple What Am I pile lineup, right? That would look something like a Thresh Pantheon, Gwen Shen, like Thresh Pantheon, Gwen Shen, and then like Gnar Illaoi or something, or like Gnar Varus, Gnar Taric. It's possible, but like compare that to just like lol mid-range Pantheon Varus, Illaoi Fiora, Gnar Darius. Like that wins me the game. I think I drafted really badly. I'm really disappointed in my draft, which is on my next slide. I'm pretty upset by this. I think that I shot myself in the foot by picking the Illaoi. And you might say it's the Fiora, but the Fiora was me submitting to my defeat while my Illaoi was giving me the opportunity to fuck up, I think. I don't have much flexibility. I've got flexibility with who... Like, I've got options, but they don't make it flexible, right? It's the same power level either way. I think that I didn't feel forced to play stuff that wasn't intrinsically strong. I was never put in a position where I was forced to take stuff that would force me to desire flexibility. I was always in positions where I could take power and feel fine with it in terms of a winning state, right? If I was to imagine my winning state, every single time I, like in the first 5 picks or 6 picks, I had power visible to me, right? If I didn't have power visible to me, I would have been forced to take the flexible options. But I never felt forced to take that stuff because of the power of the stuff that was available. Now, this issue I've just described of seeing power and feeling forced to take it isn't fundamentally an issue. It's an issue when you prioritize power over fun. And I think in a format like I was in, I coerced myself into justifying power over fun. And that is intrinsically a Spidz problem, right? When I'm complaining about how I've got too many mid-range champions and I can't do what I think is really cute about this format, where you've got the option of aggro, the option of control, the option of mid-range, and you can like create them at your own capacity, right? Which is what appealed to me a lot about the format. I myself am the only one to blame for not giving myself that permission. It's inherently my fault. And there are parts that I can blame the format, but the format isn't the main issue to the feeling I have of lack of flexibility and lack of accessing the draft in the way I wanted. Good morning, future Spidz interjecting here. Now, the statements I'm saying during 2 or 3 days ago Spidz is recording this are still true. I am unhappy with the champions I've gotten in terms of the flexibility in a broader sense. Now, I think I'm going to mention this in a little bit, but I want to clarify that the draft format had the capacity of being 150% up Spidz's alley, right? I am in love with this idea, and so many aspects of it are cool. There are 4 or 5 aspects of it that I think are absolutely fascinating. All I did was fail myself in accessing one of those aspects, and maybe 2, right? There are a few aspects. There's the preparation for your next opponent. There's messing around with decks and specific tech cards, right? There's messing around with the champion combinations you want to go, the lineup construction, but also in what you draft and how that influences all of those other things that come after it. And I think I unfortunately missed out on a lot of that first little phase. Now that it's been a few days, I have messed around with a few deck concepts, and I've enjoyed messing around with those concepts. All of these have not been the powerful stuff like the Pantheon Fiora and stuff. This has all been Gwen Taric or something, right? And I think that is still fun, and I'm glad I've got access to that, but that wasn't what I was desiring out of this. That's one of the things that I missed out of that format, and coming just out of that experience of fucking up that main bit, and that was the main priority at that time, is why I sound so down bad about it, right? I still think I could have done this better, right? Post a few days away, Spidz isn't happy about what I've done, right? I still wish I hadn't picked Illaoi, and I actually think I'd rather have Illaoi than Pantheon. I wish I hadn't picked Pantheon. I wish I hadn't picked Varus. Pantheon and Varus I think are really boring champions. The only Pantheon deck I've ever liked is Pantheon Fiora, and the only Varus deck I've liked is and then there would be a blank spot there because there's none. So I'm a little bit disappointed in that sense. And I think one thing you've got to realize is that over the past 6 months, even 12 months, I've done nothing but interact with the competitive community with Illaoi, right? Now, I never used to be a competitive player before that, and I still don't consider myself a competitive player, or didn't for a long, long time during those 12 months. But the last, months and months, all I've done is interact with competitive people. And I think over time, I have, via osmosis, stolen their mindsets a little. And it's a mindset that I actually don't enjoy all that much. I think analyzing cards competitively is fun, but not to the exclusion of other forms of analysis. And I think it's an enjoyable experience to think about things in that form, but I shouldn't have converted that necessarily into the types of things I play. NEMR has a really cool anecdote when we were prepping for Worlds, that when we were still deciding on decks, apparently for a good couple of hours, I was sounding super glum about my lineup. And then we decided to pivot to monkeys, and then I started enjoying myself. And fundamentally, I think that obviously the point of every game is to have fun, right? Above and beyond all else. And I think over the past few months, I've sort of over-stunlocked myself into thinking about competitivity and forgot to think about fun for a lot of that. This might sound crazy to you, but genuinely over the 7 days between the draft champions being announced and drafting, not a single time did I ever consider picking champions for fun. That thought never crossed my mind. And having gone past that and experiencing what I drafted now, that's really disappointed me. And I think in future, when it comes to draft, when it comes to tournaments, when it comes to Runeterra Opens, when it comes to Aegis or Sentinels, I'm going to be a lot more personally assured that I'm not going to pick things for competitive reasons. I'm going to pick them because I find them fun. You might think of this as competitive player person, which is like primarily my audience, that this is like an absurd thing, or maybe some sort of like weird space to be in. But this is my first foray into competitive nonsense. And while it's fun to analyze things, I really disliked the way that week has felt in hindsight. During that week of deciding what champions to talk about and all the conversations have, they were really fun conversations. Right? Analyzing things is fun, but never ever once considering I should pick a champion because I find it fun is such a sad way, in my opinion, to reflect on myself as someone that really enjoys this game for its fun reasons, right? Had I had different options, I wouldn't have picked Pantheon, I wouldn't have picked Varus. I probably would have kept with Illaoi, but I think I would have changed into other champions I find more enjoyable in those tiers. I hope that clarifies my position more and gets you to understand more of the kind of person that I am when it comes to the way I'm feeling about my draft. And you'll hear me talk about more how I was in the moment when I'm going over the enemies lineups, but going forward, like this experience this week has definitely changed the way I've been approaching LOR in the past year. And I definitely want to prioritize fun more than I have been, right? Anyway, I'll let you continue watching the rest of this where we talk about the enemies, deck list, and then my feedback for the format. Bye. Right, let's just move on to the next page, because I think the next page has what I wanted to talk about. Sorry, it's the page after this. This is what everyone drafted. You can quickly take a look at it. It'll be here for like the next 30 minutes, so don't worry too much. I'm going to quickly mention the champs that weren't picked. Elise, Siva, and Trundle. No Trundle surprised me. I thought Trundle would have been taken very, very quickly in terms of having access to Freljord, having access to Overwhelm, having access to timelines or like non-Trintamere FDR. But opportunity cost is the reason why Trundle wasn't picked. Right, the people that want Trundle are the same people that also want Nora and also want Katarina and stuff, right? And so picking Trundle just doesn't do it. I think Trundle stomachs you more than Nora and Katarina do. Fizz, Lulu, Zed, Ziggs, Nocturne, Talia, Udyr. Fizz, Lulu, and Ziggs not being picked interested me, but I think it goes to show that by having two important things in the same area, right, like all the Band or City champions were in A and you only get 2 A champions, is why Fizz, Lulu, Ziggs weren't picked. They are amazing, but that combination makes it really hard, right? I think A ended up being one of the most competitive areas just because there's so many good things in A. B, Lucian, Zillion, Lissandra, Riven, Renekton, Xerath, Garen, Gallia, Ornn. I think some of these are fine. Riven could have been taken, Garen could have been taken. I think those would have been like okay picks, same with Renekton. Like, I don't think there's any issue with picking those, but they just weren't picked. And then Ahri, Evelynn, Malphite were the only C tiers not taken, which makes sense because Talia wasn't taken, right? And Evelynn, the person that picked Kaisar ended up getting Jarvan, and I think Jarvan's the best champion you can compare with Kaisar. I only realized that after I did all my theory, though. Alright, let's go through what everyone got. Puffball Panda, aka the Holy Heretics, has 3 Targonians, 2 Piltovans. Actually, they're 2 Zornites. 2 Zornites, 2 Demacians. She has access to Starspring, and then there's unfortunately 2 Runeterrans, which does remove your deck building. But there's 0 things else from that. There's nothing else. That I've listed everything that they've got. So while I think Puffball has a really interesting option where you're combining stuff like your Diana and your Jinx, I think Puffball's going to have a lot of fun time deck building. It might be pretty easy to play into Puffball because she's only got like 3 regions and maybe Kench, right? Like she doesn't have that much she can play for, right? So I think Puffball will be really easy to like prepare for. But I really like Puffball's choices in terms of the fun that is found from them, right? Like, I think you can have lots of fun trying to make Quinn Kale work, or try and make Jinx Vayne work or something. I think that's a really cool idea. I quite like how Puffball has mulliganed. Maiden Heaven, which is Absolution, has Akshan, Jarvan, Veigar, Senna, Jax, Lee Sin, Jin, Kennen, Tristana, Kaisar. Similarly to Puffball, you've got 3 main represented regions, Bandle, Shurima, and Ionia, and you've also got access to Darkness, just straight up as a deck. But you've got 2 Runeterran champions, and you don't have much of else. I think... Look, Absolution's fine. You can just run, like, Darkness, you know, Jax Akshan, or Jax Tristana, and, like, you know, Jarvan Kaisar, Jin Kennen, because that's who he is, and I think you're remaining with like Lee Sin and something. I think that's fine. Your regions are pretty awkward. You don't really have, like, your regions just look weird. The regions don't really mesh too well. But we'll see how Absolution works. I think that's fine. Dale Brazil, which is Mafrahu, has Nora, which is good job. You got the Nora, you win. Sejuani, Kindred, Viego, Ezreal, Draven, Pyke, Tryndamere, Rek'Sai, Nasus. So importantly, they have Nora and they've got Lurk. Right? That's pretty good. They've got 2 SIs and 2 Freljords, so they can play a bunch of control. And then they've got a bunch of random nonsense. They've got, you know, Nasus and Ezreal and Draven and, like, random stuff. I think Dale Brazil's fine. I think Dale Brazil's going to have really a lot of fun working out what 3rd deck and maybe 2nd deck to bring. But, like, Pyke is already built for them. Like, and Nora plus anything's pretty decently built. I think the most fun that Dale Brazil is going to have is probably going to be working out how to build that 3rd deck, right? Do you want to do Viego, Sejuani, or do you want to do, like, Ezreal, Draven, Trivy, right? Like, you've got options. Capital Circuit has TF, Rumble, Heimer, Jace, Lux, Sion, Yi, Braum, Vladimir, Rise. And I think it's really important to see Capital Circuit's line up as Rumble, Sion, Jake's Lux, Rise, Yi, Vlad, Braum. Right? I think these are pretty obviously Capital's decks. I think that's not too surprising. Capital's got something similar to what I've got, which is, like, you know, a bunch of very obvious decks. But the difference with Capital's is that, like, they don't have that as much flexibility as mine have between each other. But that flexibility doesn't really matter, right? You can run, like, a Heimer in your Jace Lux. You can run, like, a TF instead of, I don't know, Sion, and do some, like, cool Rumble aggro deck, which I think is really cute. I think it's pretty obvious to see Capitals in that capacity. Ramus Ranch Rages, which is Elzon, has 3 PNC champs. You've got Zoe Timo, which is just a good deck. But my concern with Elzon is that there's Kayn, Mao, Anivia, Asol, Hecarim, and not enough stuff to synergize with your Kayn, Maokai, Anivia, Australian Soul, Hecarim. Right? Like, if you had Thresh, that would change everything. You can do Maokai, Asol, you can do Maokai, Anivia, with, like, you know, like Neverglade Collector and like the 7 mana card that creates itself when something is summoned because it kills it. You know, the friend, you know what I'm talking about. I think Elzon might have fun, but my concern with the type of fun Elzon is going to have over the type of fun that Holy Heretics is going to have is that I think Elzon's decks that they're going to end up making, the synergy that ends up, like, appearing, or the coercion that ends up appearing, will feel less fun than the synergy that, like, Puffball Panda is going to, like, imbue into herself. When I say have much fun, what I'm doing is I'm imagining myself in the position if I had their 10. Right? Like, if I had Puffball's 10, I'd have a lot of fun. It'd be pretty easy to fight me because I've got the 3 regions, but I'd have a lot of fun deck building as Puffball Panda. I wouldn't have that much fun with Absolution. I think it'd be cute, but I wouldn't want to play it for, like, 8 weeks. I think Dale Brazil is fun to do once, and then I'd get bored after the 8 weeks. And I think Capital Circuit is somewhat fun in which decks you decide to bring, but less fun in the deck building, right? That's how I would go about thinking about Capital Circuit. And going to Elzon, I think you would be really happy when you win, because you'd have your Kayn Anivia deck, and you'd be like, oh my god, I did my Kayn Anivia deck. Or, you know, Victor Kayn or whatever. But I think you will, unfortunately, If I was Elzon, I would not enjoy Spidz. And when I say I was Elzon, I'm not saying Elzon should feel this way. I'm saying if I Spidz was with Elzon's lineup, how would I feel about it? If they enjoy this, more power to them. I don't really care, right? Tempo Mao Demon Diff team has, similarly to Capitao Circuit, 4 very obvious decks. Ash LeBlanc, Azir Aurelia, Not plus an SI champion, and MF Swain. Shyvana can fit into somewhere. You can make like Shyvana Ash happen or something, or Shyvana MF or something. Shyvana Yuumi is probably fine enough, right? That's basically Pantheon Shyvana, but instead of Pantheon, you've got Yuumi. Like, you can make that work. You can make not Aurelia work with Misfortune. But besides that, like, it's similar to Capitao Circuit. I think you'd have a lot of fun deciding which decks to bring and how to tech your decks, but less fun deciding what those decks are even going to be to start with. Aikado. I think Aikado has my favorite lineup. If I could steal anyone's here, it would be Aikado's. Aikado has a bunch of cool champions: Katarina, Aphelios, Leona, Seraphine, Gangplank, Karma. I like all of those champions. I wish I had half of those. I think the person that won the most here is Aikado. I think Aikado has the best lineup by far, both in terms of fun and both in terms of strength. Now, you've got so many options you can make with these. You can do like Katarina, Leona, Annie, like Poppy, and then like, I don't know, Gangplank, Yasuo, and have like a triple aggro lineup, right? You can do a control lineup with Katarina, Annie, Seraphine, Katarina, Gangplank, or Katarina, Nami maybe. No, Aphelios, Nami, and Katarina, Gangplank, right? Like, you've got triple control. You've even got Karma in here, right? You can do mid-range. You've got like Yasuo, Katarina. You've got Poppy. You've got like Leona, Gangplank, and you've got Annie. Maybe like Nami, Seraphine, right? That's basically it. That can be anything, right? Like, I think Aikado definitely won. I think Aikado's going to win the tournament. Partly out of like, he's one of the best players here. I haven't seen a lot of these players play. I don't know how good they are. I presume they're like pretty decent. But I think like I at least know Aikado as like a really good pro player. And so I think like Aikado is probably going to win the whole tournament. And Aikado is going to also have the most fun during the tournament, I think, as well. But I think Holy Heretics is a very close second for fun. And then you've got me, who has like a million 4-mana champions, and all of them have Overwhelm and midrange. I think I've actually got the least fun. I actually don't think I'd enjoy Jale Brazil or Maiden Heaven that much, but I think I've got the least fun lineup out of all of them, which saddens me, right? Because I was really hyped for this to be a fun moment. I'm going to have fun. It's going to be an enjoyable experience, but the expectations I had set for myself in terms of enjoyability aren't met due to my own fault, which I think is something I'm trying to repeat, to put yourself in the mindset of where I think I am when it comes to the tournament right now. But look, if I could be Puffball Panda or Aikado, I would. I think they have the most fun lineups to play around with. And I really respect Puffball Panda for choosing what she did. I really like how Puffball Panda chose. And I want to respect Aikado. I really do. But Mans took my Leona and my Karma. Like, I would be so much happier if I had Leona and Karma. I'd still have like similar problems, but at least I'd have more fun between them because I like Leona and Karma more than I like Shen and Varus and Pantheon as champions. Anyway, final thing is future desires. I'm going to try and make this section... I was going to say make this section. I don't care if it's long. It doesn't matter. I wanted to talk about some feedback about the format itself. I don't want this to be seen as complainy, but most feedback comes from a feeling of, I didn't like this, what can we do about it, right? So it's going to sound complainy. But I think, for me, it isn't necessarily a complaint. It's how I think a format could be done better and more fun in future. I got a few things. I want to talk about balance quickly. I think balance is nigh impossible, especially for your first time doing this around. Besides obvious mishaps like Varus and Pantheon, like Varus and Illaoi or something. I actually think the balance was pretty decent, right? It's easy to point out the outliers of Ryze and Varus, but there were so many non-outliers that I think the balance was pretty fucking good. I want to give props that the balance was mostly decent, right? The draft is champion-centric. You are only drafting champions, right? If we're going to retain champion-centric drafting, how can we deal with some of the issues that champion-centric drafting has? One of them is that they're an intrinsically powerful package that need little splashage. They're inherently powerful on their own, right? Illaoi, Jax, Varus, Panth, right? These things are so incredibly strong. It's my fault for relying on them, but how can we make it so that this isn't as much of an issue in the future, right? Could we balance champions around being forced to bring certain things? Like Illaoi must come with Nagake Boros. Pantheon must come with Starhound pack, right? Varus is forced to come with Ice Veil Archer. Ice Veil Cultist, right? Like, these are ways to make them worse while giving cards that are worse, like, I don't know, Ken and like guaranteed Pokestick or something, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Is that a way of making the champions feel as if they aren't forced to be used in certain ways, right? Or is it worth just excluding champs? If we removed the entirety of the S and the A tier, would this have been more fun? And I think yes. If there was no S or A tier and you only got to pick 7 champions, I think that would be a lot more fun. I would much rather a format like that. Because I think what's most fun about draft formats is picking things that are not seen in constructed and forcing them to be powerful, right? My main example for this is Infinite Mind Splitter. Infinite Mind Splitter has not seen play for a while, but if I am given Infinite Mind Splitter, I will be so happy to try and make Infinite Mind Splitter work because it's a really cool card. And I think in the future, a perfect, ideal draft format is a non-champ-centric draft format. Now, that is hard. That is so hard to do, especially as a spectator and as an organizer. I think non-champ-centric draft formats is really, really hard. But I think, in the far future, and if I was to run a draft format, I would try and make sure that it's not champion-centric, right? I want to give people a Scented Poro, an Infinite Mind Splitter, and Wrath of the Sunderer, and say, make this work, right? You're forced to run 3 Infinite Mind Splitter, or maybe 2 if they're expensive. Like, you're forced to run Infinite Mind Splitter and Thresh in a deck, have fun, right? You're forced to run a Scented Poro and Katarina in a deck, have fun, right? I think that'd be a more fun way of doing a draft format. And the last one is that this is a weekly series. I think because it's a weekly series, to me, as someone that unfortunately thinks overly competitive, that I stun-locked myself into making sure that I would pick strong champions as opposed to fun champions. If this was a shorter event, I think you could justify having fun for like 2 days and, you pick your champions and you've got your random like Azir and, Kennen, make Azir Kennen work. But having like a longer format with so many, like 10 champions, it is so easy to just treat it as a normal league where you go for your powerful options. Maybe that's a Spidz problem, but I'd rather do the draft 3 times over 3 weeks and do 3 separate events. And in all of them, you pick only 8 champions or 6 champions or 7 champions. And they're all low power level and you don't have to feel like you're stuck with your champions for multiple weeks, right? One of the big limiters that I didn't take fun champions is that I didn't want to feel stuck with them for like, what ends up being like an over 2-month event, right? And then doing it multiple times, so you get to explore with different fun strategies, I think would be more enjoyable than the weekly series. Now, weekly series does have some value, right? It allows you to mess around with the deck building more intricately, but not with as much breadth. Because different runs would give you different access to different breadth, is my opinion. But this is all stuff that isn't... like, this format's fine. Like, I'm enjoying this. I think this is cool. I've been recording for nearly 2 hours, I think. 1.5 hours. This actually took less time than I thought it would. But I hope you enjoyed listening to me. I don't think I went into as much depth as I would like to. There's a few things that I think I could have explained that I didn't. Like, stuff about, it's probably better to have... I think it would be better to have Zillion and Echo than Pantheon and Malphite, for example, right? Like, that sort of general strategy, I think is something that is important to mention, but I didn't end up mentioning it here. And, yeah, I think the final takeaway is something I've mentioned a few times, but I am disappointed in my draft. I think I wrote Jelly underneath Aikado. That was a pun. One is that he's got a bunch of options, so he can mess around with them. They're wobbly like jelly. And the other one is that I'm jealous of what Aikado got. Or envious? I never remember the difference. Because I think Holy Heretics and Yep Croc have such interesting options. I'm just like enamored by their choices. I think in terms of like competitive strength, I will do fine. Like I think my lineup will work well. I think I've got a lot of power, and I think I'm gonna enjoy it a lot more once I'm planning for each week. Like I know who am I fighting next week? I can actually check this. Hold on. All right, I've just checked. My first opponent is Capitao Circuit. So I'm going to be fighting the Rumble Scion, Jace Lux, Rise Yi, Vlad Braum. So when I'm like planning for this, like I'm going to find it really fun to say maybe I'm banning Rise Yi and trying to out mid-range. Or maybe I'm going to enjoy saying I'm going to go low to the ground mid-range and try and beat Rise Yi. Right, I think I've got some really interesting options and that's going to be fun to mess around with. But it'd be more fun if I was Puffball or Aikado, basically. I hope you've enjoyed me rambling. If you did, make sure to smash the most recent Aikado videos like button, and also the most recent Monte Cristo videos like button. If you like this, like those two videos. And if you've got any thoughts about the draft, let me know. There are things I missed. You know, I've been talking about this for maybe like a collective like 24 hours with people, to varying degrees of depth. So it's hard to condense all of my thoughts that I, conglomerated from others into one. But if I was to do this again, I would prioritize fun more than I did. If I was to do this again. I think that's my main takeaway that I got from this. But thank you for watching, and I shall see you. Well, if you're watching this, you're probably not watching Hades, so I'm not going to see you tomorrow. Unless you really want me to do my Gauntlet Complainy video, and then you will see me tomorrow. I'll see you in like a week when we fight Capitao. But goodbye.